St. Petersburg, 1849. Let's just try and picture the scene together. It's December, biting cold. I mean, the kind that gets right into your bones.
Unforgiving.
Exactly. You're out in this public square, Semyonovsky Square, snow everywhere, probably, and you're tied to a post.
Not alone either. There are others.
21 other young men right next to you, also tied up, and you're all just wearing these thin black robes, shivering.
And it's not just the cold making you shake, is it?
No way. It's terror. Just absolute bone-deep fear. You've got soldiers standing maybe a few feet away, guns up, aimed right at you.
Ready to fire.
Then this officer starts reading out a decree loudly so the whole crowd can hear, and then the final command over and over again. 20 times he says it. Shoot 'em all.
20 times. Just imagine hearing that countdown.
As your body's shaking, maybe you look up, see a flash of light off a church dome nearby, a tiny, desperate flicker of hope maybe, a sign.
Or just the last glimpse of the world.
And then bang, a black cloth goes over your face,
Right.
total darkness. The officer finishes the command. You're 28 years old.
Fyodor Dostoevsky.
And you're literally seconds from death by firing squad.
It's an incredible, horrifying scene. And the key thing really is understanding why he was even there.
Yeah, what was the crime?
Well, that's just it. He wasn't a murderer or a thief or anything like that. He hadn't done anything violent.
So what had he done?
According to the material you gave us, his crime was reading. Reading certain books and talking about ideas. Ideas the government thought were dangerous.
Just reading and talk.
Essentially, yes. It paints a really stark picture of that society, doesn't it? Where just thinking differently, questioning things, could get you killed.
It's almost unbelievable facing execution for intellectual curiosity.
Right.
And it just immediately makes you ask, how does someone go through that? How do experiences like standing before a firing squad or enduring exile or dealing with intense family trauma, how does that shape a mind?
A mind capable of writing what he wrote.
Exactly. Those incredibly deep, often dark, complex novels that are still seen as some of the greatest ever. How do you survive that kind of life and create that kind of art?
Well, that's really the core question for our deep dive today, isn't it? We've got this source material detailing his life, the key moments, the big traumas.
So our mission is to dig into these sources.
Exactly, to pull out the insights and try to understand how these extraordinary, often terrible events weren't just, background noise in his life. They were the fire that forged his voice, his philosophy, the very heart of his books.
How the man's life poured onto the page.
Precisely. We'll see how it all connects.
Okay, let's do it. Let's start right back there. At that moment in 1849, can you walk us through the details leading up to that execution scene based on the sources?
Sure. The material really emphasizes the atmosphere of that day. See, Petersburg, December, brutally cold. Semyonovsky Square packed with onlookers, soldiers everywhere.
The public spectacle.
Absolutely intended as one. And those 22 men, young intellectuals mostly, brought out for what everyone assumed were their final moments, tied to posts, wearing only those thin black robes.
Which must have made the cold even worse.
Deliberately so, the sources suggest, to add physical suffering to the psychological terror. And the fear wasn't abstract, it was physical. They were shivering from cold and, sheer terror.
And their crime, as we said, wasn't what you normally think of. They were involved with the Petrushevsky Circle. Tell us about that group.
Right, the Petrushevsky Circle. They were active in the 1840s in St. Petersburg. Founded by Mikhail Petrushevsky, the sources describe him as a visionary, someone genuinely interested in reforming Russia.
So, not plotting violence.
No, not according to the material. They were young thinkers, writers, philosophers meeting secretly, yes, but mainly to discuss books and ideas.
What kind of ideas?
Things like utopian socialism, which was circulating in Europe, human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and crucially, the need for major social reforms in Russia, especially getting rid of serfdom.
Serfdom. Basically a form of slavery, right?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Millions treated as property. So, discussing its abolition was radical, even dangerous.
Dangerous to whom?
To the Tsar, Nicholas I. The sources are clear. He was an absolute ruler, total power. The name Tsar even comes from Caesar,
Ah, right.
And he saw any group meeting independently, any discussion of reform, especially anything socialist or liberal, as a direct threat to his power. He was terrified of revolution.
Like the ones happening elsewhere in Europe.
Exactly. So he clamped down hard.
Leading to the arrests in 1849.
Yes, a major crackdown. The Tsar ordered a hunt for anyone connected to the Petrushevsky Circle. People were dragged from their homes, arrested in the middle of the night, just rounded up.
And Dostoevsky was caught in this net?
He was. He apparently had books linked to the circle, books considered subversive. The sources say he was arrested pretty quickly, without much interrogation.
And charged with.
Treason, the most serious charge. He was thrown into a fortress prison cell to await his fate.
Which led to that mock execution. It sounds like it was designed purely for psychological torture and public intimidation.
Oh, absolutely. A terrifying lesson. The sources detail the whole ritual. Coffins were brought out, placed nearby.
Ready for them.
Soldiers lined up, muskets aimed. The officer reading the death sentence loud and clear for the crowd, and then repeating that order, shoot them all, 20 times, counting down their lives.
I can't even imagine hearing that.
Unbearable. And remember, they're freezing in those thin robes, physical misery piled on top of the mental anguish. Then the final act, covering each man's face with a black hood.
Isolating them completely.
Cutting them off. Dostoevsky wrote about it later, his body shaking uncontrollably, not knowing if it was the cold or just pure terror. And that image he remembered, the light from the church dome.
Just before the darkness fell, a last moment of something.
Hope. Resignation. Who knows? But then the hood came down. The soldiers were ready.
Seconds away from the shots.
The order was given. They were blindfolded, just waiting for the sound. The sources make it sound like it was truly imminent. The tension must have been immense.
But then, it didn't happen.
The most incredible twist. Right at the very last moment, as the soldiers were about to fire, a messenger bursts into the square.
On horseback.
Yes, waving a white handkerchief, shouting, "Stop! Stop!" He had a new order from the Tsar.
Pardon. Freedom.
Not quite freedom. A commutation. The death sentences were changed. The officer read the new decree.
So what was the new sentence?
Exile to Siberia. For Dostoevsky, it was initially set at 8 years of katorga, hard labor.
From a certain death to, well, a living hell, but still life. The shock must have been unbelievable. The sources mention the immediate impact was devastating for some.
The psychological whiplash was intense. To go right to the edge of death, accept it, and then be violently pulled back.
Yeah.
It broke some of them.
Like Grigoriev.
Exactly. The sources say he went permanently insane, right there on the spot. Never recovered. Others suffered physically from the ordeal, especially the prolonged exposure to that bitter cold and thin clothes.
How many?
The sources suggest 4 or 5 died soon after, from lung problems or other illnesses caused by the cold, and another 3 or 4 apparently got severe ear infections that plagued them for life.
So even the reprieve had fatal consequences for some, and Dostoevsky. He survived physically, but...
But the sources are clear. The deepest wound wasn't physical. It was on his soul. That experience, facing annihilation, that feeling of being in what one source calls a long tunnel between life and death where a river of darkness flows, that never left him.
It became part of him.
Fundamentally. It reshaped how he saw everything, life, death, faith, humanity. It's often cited as a key reason for the darkness, the psychological intensity in his novels. It wasn't abstract for him. He'd lived it.
And he used it directly in his writing, didn't he?
Most famously in The Idiot. Prince Mishkin gives this incredibly vivid description of a man's final thoughts before execution. It mirrors Dostoevsky's own experience so closely. The psychological detail is just piercing. You can feel the author's memory behind the words.
So that moment on the square, it's a foundational trauma. But the sources suggest let's say, the emotional landscape for his novels, the seeds of that darkness, were planted much earlier in his family life.
Yes, definitely. The sources take us back to his childhood in Moscow, born 1821, middle-class family. But the key thing was the contrast between his parents.
His father, Mikhail Dostoevsky, described as strict, rule-bound.
Very much so. He was a doctor at a military hospital for the poor. So young Fyodor saw the suffering of the poor early on, which surely influenced him.
But his relationship with his father was difficult.
Strained, yes. The sources describe Mikhail as emotionally distant, harsh. Dostoevsky felt neglected. There's a suggestion his father's severity came from his own bitterness about life.
And his mother, Maria.
The opposite, apparently. Kind, deeply religious, his main source of affection and emotional support.
So a real tension there. Stern father, loving mother.
Exactly. And the sources connect this directly to his writing. That constant push and pull between, say, harsh reason and compassionate faith, or cruelty and love, it echoes his parents.
And tragically, his mother died young.
When he was only 15. A huge loss, taking away that source of warmth.
And after that, he was sent off to St. Petersburg to military engineering school.
Him and his older brother, Mikhail. But the sources are very clear Fyodor had zero interest in engineering or the military.
So why go?
Purely to please his father. It was his father's wish. Dostoevsky's dream, even then, was always literature, exploring human nature through stories. but he did his duty.
Meanwhile, his father retired and bought a small estate, a farm.
Yes, in the Tula region. And life for the laborers there, the serfs, sounds horrendous, treated like property, worked brutally.
Pretty standard for Russia then, sadly.
Yes. And after Dostoevsky's mother died, his father's state seems to have really declined. The sources say he started drinking heavily, consumed by grief, became mentally unstable,
Hallucinations.
seeing and talking to his dead wife's ghost, holding conversations with her, asking questions, even answering in her voice. It sounds like a complete breakdown.
And it turned into paranoia and abuse towards his own daughters.
Yes, the ones living with him. He became convinced they were sneaking lovers into their rooms. He'd apparently barge in at night, drunk, waving a gun, searching under beds, in cupboards. Terrifying for them.
And his treatment of the laborers got worse too.
Definitely. The sources give some disturbing examples, like beating a worker savagely for not saluting him properly,
Yeah.
then turning around and beating other workers who did stop working to salute him, calling them lazy. Just impossible, unpredictable cruelty.
And this escalation, it led to his death, according to the sources.
It seems so. There's a specific incident described. His father was counting laborers, found 3 missing, was told they were sick. He flew into a rage, convinced they were faking, and went after them.
Grabbed a stick, got in his carriage, said he was going to cure them himself. Found them walking on the road.
What happened?
He attacked them violently with the stick. But this time, the sources say, the laborers fought back. And they killed him.
Killed by his own serfs. But this wasn't the official story, was it? It was covered up.
Yes, and the sources point to a chillingly practical reason. Shame was part of it, of course. A landowner killed by his laborers was disgraceful.
But there was more.
Economics, mainly. If the police investigated, the laborers would be arrested, jailed, maybe exiled, and the family would lose them. Replacing laborers, buying new ones, cost a fortune, thousands, maybe millions of rubles. The family couldn't afford it.
So they hushed it up to avoid financial ruin.
Seems like it. They buried the truth, likely reported it as illness or maybe an accident.
Which means even today, historians aren't absolutely certain.
That's what the sources suggest. The cover-up means there's still debate. Some accept the illness story. Others believe the murder account is more likely, given his behavior. But for Dostoevsky himself, hearing the news, however it was framed, was devastating.
Profoundly. He was at college in St. Petersburg, broke, feeling resentful towards his father. Apparently his father had just sent him 2 rubles when he'd asked for 10.
Ouch.
And when he heard his father was dead, he asked exactly when it happened. The time, the date, and the realization hit him.
What realization?
That at the very moment his father was dying, he, Dostoevsky, was sitting in his room, cursing his father, wishing him ill over those few rubles.
Oh my God, the timing.
It triggered something physical, immediate. The sources say he collapsed in a violent seizure, frothing at the mouth, unconscious.
His first seizure.
Seems this traumatic realization was the trigger. And afterwards, intense emotional thoughts, especially about his father, could bring on similar fits or fainting spells throughout his life.
And the guilt. Even miles away, he felt responsible.
Deeply morally responsible. It's described as this profound, almost irrational guilt, as if his negative thoughts had somehow caused or willed his father's death.
That's a heavy burden.
And it became a huge theme in his work. That specific kind of guilt.
Especially in the brothers Karamazov, right? The sources really highlight that connection.
Absolutely. Even Karamazov's story is the clearest echo. Ivan doesn't physically kill his father in the novel someone else does, but Ivan has thought about it, desired it, maybe even implicitly encouraged it. And he feels the crushing guilt, the moral responsibility, just as strongly as if he'd done it himself.
So that idea of wanting a crime, someone else doing it, but you still feel the guilt that came directly from Dostoevsky's own life.
The sources make a very strong case for it.
Yeah.
That feeling of complicity through thought or desire, it shows up again and again in his characters. It's like Kafka, you know. His difficult relationship with his father profoundly shaped his writing, too. It becomes this deep wellspring for their art.
So long before the firing squad, his inner world was already incredibly complex. Suffering, family tension, this deep guilt. No wonder his ambition was to write about it all.
It seems like it was almost a compulsion. And he did start writing professionally early on, before the arrest. His first novel, Poor Folk, came out in 1846.
What was it about?
The struggles of poor, ordinary people, told through letters. It was actually quite successful. Got him noticed in the St. Petersburg literary scene.
And connected him with groups like the Petrushevsky Circle?
Yes, he was drawn to those intellectual circles, the talk of reform, though the sources say he later distanced himself from some of their more radical ideas.
Yeah.
But that early success, it also attracted jealousy.
From other writers.
Established ones. Figures like Ivan Turgenev, who Dostoevsky initially looked up to, and Nikolai Nekrasov. They couldn't quite match his unique voice, apparently, so they resorted to mocking him.
Personally.
Viciously, according to the sources. Made fun of how he looked, walked, talked, ridicules his writing style, his serious themes.
And the sources describe Dostoevsky as quite sensitive, maybe a bit awkward socially back then.
Yeah, eager for acceptance, maybe a bit naive about people's motives. He wanted connections, maybe romance, but was nervous.
Which led to that awful party incident.
Oh yeah, the fainting story. Apparently, he was at some high society gathering, saw a beautiful woman, got completely flustered trying to approach her, stumbled, and just fainted. Right there.
Mortifying.
Totally.
Oh.
And of course, it became instant gossip, more fuel for the mockery. And then Turgenev, who he thought was a friend, supposedly encouraged Nekrasov to write a satirical poem about him.
A published poem.
Published and widely circulated, used specifically to humiliate him. The sources mention some of the lines comparing him to a pimple on literature's nose or a red zit, just brutal personal attack.
That's incredibly cruel, but the sources note the irony, the poetic justice later on.
It's a great point. Nekrasov is mostly forgotten now. Turgenev is still known, but maybe fading a bit in comparison. While Dostoevsky, his star just keeps rising. The pimple became this towering figure relevant centuries later. A star, not a zit.
A satisfying outcome. The sources also mention his second novel, The Double, wasn't well received either, adding to his struggles before the 1849 arrest. So it was already a mix of hope, failure, humiliation.
All feeding into the man and the future writer. Which brings us back to Siberia. After the mock execution, he was sent off to the labor camp in Omsk.
4 years of hard labor, then more years of military service, all in Siberia, and classed as a dangerous political prisoner, thrown in with hardened criminals. Must have been terrifying for an intellectual like him.
Absolutely brutal, appalling conditions, back-breaking work, surrounded by murderers and thieves. But the sources say something remarkable happened.
What's that?
He started observing them, listening, even connecting with some of them. Despite the horror, he learned about their lives, their stories, their ways of thinking.
And use that later.
Directly. His book, The House of the Dead, is based entirely on his time in the prison camp. It's part memoir, part fiction, giving this raw look inside the Russian penal system and the lives of these prisoners.
So Siberia wasn't just punishment, it was research in a way.
In transformation. Living side by side with peasants and criminals gave him this deep, first-hand understanding of their suffering, their faith, which was often simple but profound. The sources stress how suffering and faith became central pillars of his later work because of this.
It pushed him philosophically, too.
Definitely. Isolated, facing harsh realities, he grappled with the big questions. Good, evil, freedom, human nature. It was a brutal education, but it shaped him profoundly, intellectually, and spiritually.
When he finally returned to European Russia, he picked up writing again, but now with all this baggage. Experience,
absolutely. And one of the first major works after exile was Notes from Underground in 1864. The sources call it really significant.
Why is that?
It's often seen as one of the very first existentialist novels.
Existentialist? How so?
Because the main character, the underground man, he's this isolated, bitter, hyper-conscious guy who just rants philosophically. He dissects free will, suffering, the limits of reason, the sheer irrationality and, well, perversity of human beings.
He rejects society.
Totally. Asserts his own radical freedom, even if it makes him miserable. And those themes, freedom, consciousness, suffering, irrationality, they become central to Dostoevsky's great novels and are core ideas in existentialism.
So Siberia deepened his understanding of people and pushed his thinking into these really profound areas. And his most famous novels came after this, right? But it was still a difficult time, personally.
A real paradox. His most creative period coincided with ongoing struggles. His first marriage to Maria after his return was apparently quite tense, and she was often sick.
Yet he produced Crime and Punishment in 1866, which the sources say he wrote under huge financial pressure.
Money was almost always a problem. He was constantly writing against deadlines to pay off debts. Crime and Punishment is maybe his most famous work internationally. The story of Raskolnikov, the student who commits murder based on a theory.
And the psychological aftermath.
Exactly. Guilt, punishment, good versus evil, redemption through suffering, it's all there. It made him a global literary star. And yeah, the sources definitely suggest that book alone deserves its own deep dive.
It's that dense. But things got a bit more stable with his second marriage.
To Anna Snitkina in 1867, she'd been his stenographer, much younger, and she was apparently amazing. The sources say she brought order to his life, managed his finances, dealt with publishers, really freed him up to write.
A true partner. They had children.
4, but sadly 2 died young. More grief for him to bear.
And despite Anna's help, the money problems didn't entirely disappear, did they? Because of the gambling.
Ah, yes, the gambling addiction. That was a major, persistent demon. Kept him in debt for years. The sources describe him having that classic gambler's mindset.
Convinced the next bet would be the big one.
Exactly. Always believing he was just unlucky, that a new system would work, that he could win it all back, which, of course, rarely happens.
It got so bad they had to leave Russia sometimes.
Yeah, they'd flee to Europe, Germany, Switzerland just to escape creditors. Shows how bad it was, and also how supportive Anna must have been. And imagine the pressure needing to write constantly, furiously, just to pay off gambling debts.
Did it affect the quality of his writing?
Remarkably, the sources suggest it didn't diminish the power of the novels, but it must have been hell on his peace of mind.
And he wrote about this addiction directly, too.
In The Gambler,
Yeah.
based entirely on his own struggles.
Yeah.
And the story behind writing it is wild. He dictated the whole thing to Anna in just 26 days.
Why so fast?
He had this insane deadline from a publisher he owed money to because of gambling debts. He was literally pacing the room, dictating frantically. Incredible pressure.
Wow. And The Idiot also came out around this time, 1868, we mentioned it earlier, with the execution scene echo.
Right. Another major work from this period explores innocence, goodness, trying to be Christ-like in a fallen world. And again, that theme of resurrection through suffering, drawing on his own life, his exile, his near-death experience.
Towards the end of his life, his writing got even deeper, more complex.
Yes. The final years produced his most layered, philosophically ambitious work, still circling those core themes: suffering, faith, doubt, redemption.
Culminating in The Brothers Karamazov in 1880, often called his masterpiece.
Many consider it one of the greatest novels ever written, period. A huge philosophical saga tackling the biggest questions about life: God, freedom, evil.
And it pulls together so many threads from his own life, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The dysfunctional Karamazov family, the 3 brothers, their terrible father. It resonates so strongly with his own family history, the relationship with his father, that pervasive guilt. It's all in there, wrestled with on an epic scale.
But he died relatively young, didn't he, before he could finish everything he planned?
Tragically, yes. Only 59, just short of 60. And the sources mention he actually intended to write a sequel to The Brothers Karamazov, a whole second volume continuing the story.
What a loss for literature.
Huge. We can only imagine what that would have been.
So wrapping up this deep dive, the big takeaway from your source material is just how inseparable Dostoevsky's life was from his art.
Completely inseparable. Those extreme experiences, the firing squad, Siberia, the family trauma, the guilt, the poverty, the addiction, the losses, they weren't just background. They were the raw material. They forged his perspective, gave his writing that incredible depth, that psychological intensity, that philosophical urgency.
His books are dark and complex because his life was dark and complex.
Exactly. He knew suffering intimately. But his work isn't just about darkness. It's also about the struggle within that darkness, the search for faith, for meaning, for redemption, for how goodness can possibly exist alongside so much evil. He grappled with the questions his life forced upon him.
So understanding his life really does unlock a deeper understanding of the novels.
Immensely so. It's not just biography. It's the key to the emotional core, the philosophical weight of his fiction.
Well, we've certainly journeyed through some incredibly intense moments from Fyodor Dostoevsky's life today, using your sources as our guide. It's just so clear how those experiences shaped him.
From that freezing square in St. Petersburg to the prison camps, the gambling dens, it's all woven into the fabric of his books.
Hopefully this deep dive gives you, our listeners, a richer context for his work, a new way to appreciate where those powerful stories came from.
It definitely underscores the human cost and the incredible resilience behind those masterpieces.
And it leaves us with a pretty profound question to think about, doesn't it?
I think so. How does facing extreme suffering, whether it's personal trauma, near death, or just witnessing the worst of humanity, how does that change your fundamental understanding of good and evil?
And maybe the potential for redemption even within that darkness. How do the deepest wounds end up shaping the most profound art?
Something to definitely carry with you the next time you delve into one of his novels.